A belligerent drunk guitarist stormed the stage mid-concert, calling Eddie Van Halen a fraud and demanding he prove his legendary skills were real. Instead of having security throw him out, Eddie did something that left the entire arena speechless and changed one man's life forever. It was August 23, 1986, at the New Haven Coliseum in Connecticut, and Van Halen was in the middle of their most explosive tour of the decade. The 5150 tour was Eddie's first major run with new frontman Sammy Hagar, and every night felt like they had something to prove. The crowd of 15,000 was electric, feeding off the energy of dreams, when suddenly the music stopped cold. From the front section, a figure vaulted over the barrier and onto the stage, a guitar slung over his shoulder and fury in his eyes. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these untold moments from rock history. The man's name was Danny Kowalski, a 28-year-old session guitarist from Boston who'd been drowning his frustrations in Jack Daniels since the opening act. Danny wasn't just some random drunk. He was a genuinely talented player who'd spent years grinding in smoky clubs, recording jingles for local commercials, and watching less skilled musicians get the breaks he never did. He'd grown up worshiping Eddie Van Halen, learning every note of Eruption until his fingers bled, perfecting the tapping technique that Eddie had revolutionized. But somewhere along the way, that worship had curdled into resentment. In Danny's alcohol-soaked mind, Eddie represented everything wrong with the music industry. Here was a guy who made it look effortless, who played like a god, while Danny struggled to pay rent with his guitar skills. The bourbon told Danny that Eddie was probably a studio creation, that the legend was bigger than the reality, that someone needed to expose the truth. So when Van Halen launched into their set, Danny made a decision that would change his life. He was going to challenge Eddie Van Halen in front of 15,000 people. Security didn't react fast enough. By the time they processed what was happening, Danny was already center stage, his battered Stratocaster catching the spotlights, pointing at Eddie with his free hand. "You're a fraud, Van Halen," Danny shouted into the stunned silence, his words slurring slightly but carrying clearly through the arena's acoustics. "Everyone thinks you're a guitar god, but I bet you can't even play half the stuff people say you can. It's all studio tricks and bullshit." The crowd erupted in boos and shouts. Sammy Hagar stepped back, uncertain. Alex Van Halen stopped drumming mid-fill, his sticks frozen in the air. Michael Anthony's bass note hung in the air like a question mark, but Eddie just stood there, his striped Frankenstrat guitar hanging from his shoulders, studying this drunk stranger with an expression that was impossible to read. What? Nobody knew, what the audience didn't know, what Danny couldn't have known, was that Eddie Van Halen had been dealing with his own demons that entire tour. The pressure of replacing David Lee Roth, the constant criticism from fans who thought Sammy couldn't fill those shoes, the drinking that was starting to spiral from recreational to necessary. Eddie had spent the afternoon before the show arguing with his wife Valerie over the phone, dealing with label executives who wanted more commercial songs, and fighting the gnawing anxiety that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as good as everyone thought he was. That doubt, that imposter syndrome that haunts even the greatest artists, was eating at him. So when Danny Kowalski called him a fraud in front of 15,000 people, it hit a nerve that was already raw. Eddie's first instinct was anger. His jaw tightened, his grip on the Frankenstrat's neck went white-knuckled, and for a moment, everyone in that arena thought they were about to witness a fight. Security was already moving in, ready to drag Danny off the stage and probably straight to a holding cell. But then something shifted in Eddie's expression. He held up a hand, stopping security in their tracks. The gesture was so commanding, so unexpected, that even the advancing bodyguards froze mid-step. Eddie walked slowly toward Danny, the click of his footsteps on the stage floor somehow audible in the massive silence. When he got close enough, he could smell the bourbon on Danny's breath, could see the mixture of rage and desperation in the younger man's bloodshot eyes. "You think I'm a fraud?" Eddie said, his voice carrying through the microphone clipped to his shirt. The question wasn't aggressive. It was curious, almost gentle. "You think everything people say about me is studio tricks?" "Damn right I do," Danny shot back, though his voice had lost some of its initial fire. Being this close to Eddie Van Halen, even drunk and angry, was intimidating in ways he hadn't anticipated. Eddie nodded slowly, as if considering this accusation carefully. Then he did something that nobody, not the band, not the crew, not the 15,000 fans holding their collective breath, could have predicted. He unstrapped the Frankenstrat from his shoulders and held it out to Danny. "Prove it," Eddie said simply. The arena exploded into chaos. People were screaming, some in excitement, others in confusion, many in protest. Sammy Hagar's mouth fell open. Alex Van Halen stood up from his drum kit, clearly about to intervene. But Eddie waved them all off, his eyes never leaving Danny's face. "You came up here to prove something," Eddie continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "You want to show everyone I'm a fraud? Okay. Here's your chance. Play something. Anything. Show these people what real guitar playing looks like." Danny stared at the Frankenstrat like it was a live bomb. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd expected to be thrown out, maybe arrested. He'd expected Eddie to get defensive, to argue, to prove his skills by showing Danny up. He hadn't expected to be handed the most famous guitar in rock and roll and told to prove his point. "What's the matter?" Eddie asked, and there was no mockery in his tone, just genuine curiosity. "You've got 15,000 people waiting to hear what you can do. This is what you wanted, isn't it? A platform, a chance to show everyone you're better than me." The Frankenstrat felt heavier than Danny expected when he took it. The weight of history, maybe, or the weight of reality crashing through his bourbon-fueled bravado. His hands were shaking as he positioned the guitar, and suddenly every single thing he'd ever learned seemed to evaporate from his memory. The crowd was a blur of faces. The stage lights were blinding. Eddie Van Halen was standing 3 feet away, arms crossed, waiting. Danny's fingers found the strings. He started to play the opening to Eruption, the same solo he'd practiced 10,000 times in his bedroom, in dingy clubs, in his car between gigs. But something was wrong. The notes that had always flowed so naturally were now clumsy, hesitant. His tapping was sloppy. He missed the harmonic in the third measure. By the time he got to the finger-tapping section, he was so far off tempo that even he could hear how terrible it sounded. He stopped after barely a minute, his face burning with humiliation. The silence that followed was worse than any booing could have been. 15,000 people had just watched him fail spectacularly at playing the solo that had made Eddie Van Halen famous. The irony was crushing. But what happened next was something Danny Kowalski would remember for the rest of his life. Eddie stepped forward and gently took the Frankenstrat back. "That was brave," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Do you know how brave that was? Getting up here in front of all these people and trying?" Danny's eyes were stinging. He couldn't tell if it was from humiliation or the bourbon or something else entirely. "I fucked it up," he said, his voice barely a whisper into his own guitar's pickup. "Yeah, you did," Eddie agreed with a small smile. "But do you know why?" Danny shook his head, not trusting himself to speak. "Because you were trying to play it like me," Eddie said. "You were trying to prove you could do what I do. But here's what nobody tells you about being a musician. It's not about being better than someone else. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about finding your own voice." Eddie turned to address the crowd, his voice filling the arena. "How many of you play guitar?" he asked. Hundreds of hands went up throughout the venue. "And how many of you learned interruption?" Most of those hands stayed up, and laughter rippled through the audience. "You know what I hear every day? I hear people tell me they can play my solos note for note. And that's great. That's flattering. But you know what I never hear? I never hear their solos, their ideas, their voice." He turned back to Danny. "You came up here calling me a fraud because you're angry. I get that. But you're not angry at me. You're angry because you've spent so much time trying to sound like everyone else that you forgot to sound like yourself." "I want to hear something," Eddie said. "I want to hear you play something that's yours. Not Eruption. Not any Van Halen song. Something you wrote. Something that comes from you." Danny's head was spinning. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was supposed to expose Eddie as a fraud, to tear down the legend, to make himself feel better about his own failures. Instead, he was being asked to be vulnerable in front of 15,000 strangers. I don't know if I can," Danny stammered. "Sure you can," Eddie said encouragingly. "Look, I'll make it easier for you. I'll back you up. Whatever you play, whatever key you're in, I'll follow you. Just start playing, and don't think about it. Don't think about what it should sound like or what people want to hear. Just play what you feel." Eddie nodded to the sound engineer, who switched on Danny's guitar signal. The Stratocaster that Danny had brought on stage, that had been ignored in favor of the legendary Frankenstrat, was now live through the arena's sound system. Danny looked down at his own guitar, the one he'd played on hundreds of sessions and gigs, the one he'd almost forgotten he was still wearing. His fingers found a chord, just a simple G major, but he let it ring out, let the sustain fill the massive space. Then another chord, and another. Without planning it, without thinking about it, Danny started playing a progression he'd been messing around with for years, but never shown anyone. It wasn't flashy. There was no tapping, no speed runs, no pyrotechnics. It was just honest, melancholic, beautiful in its simplicity. And true to his word, Eddie started playing along. But he wasn't showing off. He wasn't overshadowing Danny's playing. He was supporting it, adding subtle harmonies, complementary runs that enhanced what Danny was doing without overwhelming it. Alex Van Halen, reading the room with the intuition of a veteran musician, started adding soft cymbal work. Michael Anthony laid down a gentle bass line. Sammy Hagar grabbed a tambourine and added quiet percussion. What emerged over the next 4 minutes was something none of the 15,000 people in that arena expected to hear that night. It was a song that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same way. It was Danny Kowalski's song, supported by one of the greatest rock bands in the world, played in front of thousands of people who had come to boo and stayed to witness something genuine. When the last note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the arena erupted. People were on their feet, screaming, applauding, some of them crying. Danny stood there, stunned, his guitar hanging from suddenly nerveless fingers. Eddie walked over and put his arm around Danny's shoulders. "That was yours," Eddie said quietly. just between the two of them. That was real. That was better than any perfect copy of Eruption could ever be. Eddie turned to the crowd again. "Ladies and gentlemen, Danny Kowalski." The crowd roared its approval. "You know what this man did tonight? He showed more courage than most musicians ever will. He came up here, made himself vulnerable, and created something beautiful. That's what music is supposed to be about." Then Eddie did something even more unexpected. He announced that he wanted to help Danny record that song properly, in a real studio, with proper production. He told the audience that Danny clearly had talent that deserved to be heard, and that Van Halen's production company would fund a demo session. If anyone in the audience worked in the music industry and needed a session guitarist who could play with real emotion, they should talk to Van Halen's management after the show. "Because that's what we do," Eddie said. "We help each other. We build each other up. We don't tear each other down." What happened? After Danny stayed for the rest of the concert, sitting at the side of the stage, occasionally playing along on songs when Eddie invited him. By the end of the night, he had gone from being the show's biggest disruption to being part of its most memorable moments. 3 different producers approached Van Halen's management after the show with offers for Danny. He chose to work with one based in Los Angeles, moved west 2 months later, and spent the next decade building a successful career as a session musician and composer for film and television. But more importantly, the story of what happened that night in New Haven spread throughout the music community like wildfire. It became a legendary example of how to handle confrontation with grace, wisdom, and generosity. Other musicians started talking about Eddie's handling of the heckler situation, how he'd turned a potentially ugly incident into a teaching moment, a chance for growth and redemption. "Eddie showed us that every challenge is an opportunity," said session guitarist Steve Lukather, who later cited the incident in interviews. "He could have humiliated that guy. Instead, he elevated him. That's not just good musicianship, that's good humanity." For Eddie, the incident was meaningful in ways that went beyond just one night's show. In interviews afterward, he admitted that Danny's challenge had forced him to confront his own insecurities and remember why he started playing music in the first place. "I realized that night that all the fame, all the success, all the recognition means nothing if you forget the fundamental truth," Eddie said in a radio interview weeks later. "Music is about connection. It's about expression. It's about helping each other find our voices. Danny reminded me of that, even if he didn't mean to." Eddie began, incorporating more direct audience interaction into Van Halen's shows, always looking for opportunities to connect with people who seemed to be struggling or needed encouragement. The entire New Haven incident was captured on a bootleg recording that has become one of the most treasured Van Halen audio documents among collectors. But it's not just the music that people value. It's Eddie's handling of the confrontation, his wisdom, and his generosity of spirit. "You can hear Eddie making a choice in real time," said rock historian Martin Popoff. "You can hear him deciding to choose understanding over ego, teaching over humiliation. It's a masterclass in what it means to be not just a great musician, but a great human being." The story of Eddie and Danny Kowalski became a parable in the music community about how to handle conflict and competition. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, Eddie chose to meet it with curiosity, compassion, and creativity. He turned a potential fight into a teaching moment, a hostile confrontation into a collaborative experience, and a would-be rival into a friend and colleague. Eddie proved that night that you don't defeat your critics by fighting them, said producer Bob Rock, who later worked with both Eddie and Danny on separate projects. You defeat them by helping them become better versions of themselves. Today, the story of Eddie and the drunk guitarist is taught in music business courses and cited by career counselors as an example of how mentorship can emerge from the most unexpected situations. It's referenced in conflict resolution seminars as a demonstration of turning negative energy into positive outcomes. And it's told in guitar shops around the world as a reminder that the greatest musicians aren't just technically proficient, they're emotionally intelligent and generous with their knowledge. Danny Kowalski, before his retirement from the music industry in 2015, gave several interviews about that night. In each one, he credited Eddie with saving his career and his life by showing him that music wasn't about competition or proving superiority. It was about authentic expression and mutual support. Eddie could have destroyed me that night, Danny said in his final interview for Guitar Player magazine. I came up on that stage drunk, angry, and looking to tear down a legend. Instead, he built me up. He showed me what I could be instead of punishing me for what I was. That kind of grace, that kind of wisdom, you can't teach that. You can only hope to learn it by watching someone like Eddie. The confrontation between Eddie Van Halen and Danny Kowalski reminds us that behind every act of aggression is usually a person in pain, struggling with their own insecurities and failures. And it shows us that the strongest response to hostility isn't more hostility, but understanding, compassion, and the willingness to see the potential in everyone, even those who seem to be our enemies. Eddie could have had Danny arrested, could have made jokes at his expense, could have played Eruption flawlessly just to humiliate him and prove the drunk was wrong. Instead, he chose to help him, to teach him, and to show 15,000 people what real strength looks like. He chose to create a moment that would resonate far beyond that single night, that would change one man's life and inspire countless others. The tragedy, of course, is that Eddie Van Halen died on October the 6th, 2020, after a long battle with cancer. But stories like this one ensure that his legacy extends far beyond his revolutionary guitar technique or his contributions to rock music. They remind us that Eddie was also a teacher, a mentor, and a fundamentally decent human being who understood that true greatness isn't about being better than others. It's about helping others be better. In his final years, when asked about his career highlights, Eddie often mentioned that New Haven concert. Not because of the music Van Halen played that night, but because of what happened with Danny. That was the night I remembered why I picked up a guitar in the first place, Eddie said. Not to be the best, not to prove anything, but to connect with people, to create something beautiful, and maybe to help someone else find their voice. Everything else is just noise. Nearly 40 years later, people still talk about the night Eddie Van Halen turned a drunk heckler into a collaborator, a moment of confrontation into a moment of grace. It wasn't just great entertainment, though it certainly was that. It wasn't just good musicianship, though that was on display too. It was great humanity, the kind that transcends genre and technique and fame to touch something fundamental about what it means to be human, to struggle, to create, and to help each other along the way. In a world that often seems divided by competition and anger, where social media encourages us to tear each other down, and where success is too often measured by who we've defeated rather than who we've helped, maybe that's exactly the kind of story we need to hear. Maybe that's the real legacy of Eddie Van Halen, not just the tapping technique or the brown sound or the legendary solos, but the reminder that we're all in this together, that we all struggle, and that the greatest thing any of us can do is help each other find our voices. If this incredible story of turning confrontation into connection moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about the power of choosing understanding over ego. Have you ever had a moment when someone's unexpected kindness changed your perspective completely? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more amazing, untold stories from rock history that reveal the best of human nature.